So with a name like Consolmagno and coming from the Vatican, I'm sure you were expecting a foreign accent. I don't know if it was going to be this foreign accent. I've been called many things in my life, but I have never before been called fair dinkum. What I want to talk about today is going to be a bit of an intellectual exercise, some philosophy, some history, some astronomy, some physics. Put on your seatbelts, it's going to be an interesting ride. The charge that I was given was to talk about the connection between science and religion. And I thought the way to do it is to go back to the origins of science, because science was originally part of theology, part of philosophy, they were all one part of the same whole. Now, many of you may have seen this image before, this medieval view of the universe, where you've got the flat earth and then the stars and the sun, and our monk sort of peering through the dome of the sky. I don't know how many of you have seen this picture before. It's used a lot. The first thing I want to tell you is, it's not a medieval view of the universe. It's a Victorian view of the universe, where the Victorians were making fun of the medieval view. But in fact, it's absolutely not what the medievals thought. And a lot of what we're going to have to do today in this progress is to let go of the assumptions, to let go of the things we think we already know about how the universe works and how people thought about the universe in the past. What we're talking about, in essence, is something called cosmology. Cosmology was a word invented by this fellow, Mr. Wolf, back in the 1700s. And it has come to mean not just how we think the universe works, if you're a computer type, the operating system we have in our head that allows us to take in sights and sounds and noises and interpret them in terms of a system that I think this is how the universe works. And you may have noticed this if you've ever been in a political argument with somebody who is from a different point of view than yours. Both of you look at exactly the same evidence, and both of you will say, "You see, what I said all along proves my point," because we interpret what we see in terms of what we expect to see. And that's not a bad thing. You could not think without that. But it's important to remember that every system that we use to understand the universe, to understand our own lives, comes with it assumptions. Every rational system has to start with things we assume, often without even realizing we assume them. And we're going to refer to these assumptions that we make about the universe and how that colors what we see in the universe. In particular, there are religious assumptions that you have to make in order to be able to do science. Science is based on religion. Most scientists would never say that. But let me point out, if you're going to be a scientist studying the universe, you have to assume that there's a universe there to study. If you're going to be a scientist studying the universe, looking for the laws of physics, you have to assume there are laws of physics there. If you're going to be a scientist studying the universe, you have to assume that it's actually a worthwhile thing to do, to waste a little bit of your time doing, rather than much more important things like, betting in horse races. Why do I say this is a religious assumption? There are variants of Zen Buddhism who would say that the universe is all illusion. Maybe you've heard the famous story of the monk, the philosopher, who has a dream that he's a butterfly. And then when he wakes up, he never knows for sure. Am I a philosopher who dreamed I was a butterfly, or am I a butterfly dreaming I was a philosopher? And you will never know for sure. You cannot prove, because any proof that you make would be consistent with either point of view. There's a kind of philosophy called solipsism that says, the universe doesn't exist except in my own brain, and all of you people who I see out there today are just the result of a really bad pizza I had last night. George Bernard Shaw was once giving a lecture and solipsism came up, and someone came up to him afterwards and said, "But Mr. Shaw, I'm a solipsist, and so are most of my friends." Think about it. We assume there is a universe to be studied only because we belong to a religion that allows that assumption to be consistent with our cosmology. More than that, though, think of the way the universe looked to the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks. This is a quote from Prometheus Bound. My early life, I actually studied Latin and Greek, which means I don't remember any of it anymore. The earth-born dweller of the Cilician caves was a fellow named Impetuous Typhon. He was a monster. He withstood all the gods. He hissed out terror with horrid jaws, while from his eyes lightened a hideous glare, as though he would storm the sovereignty of Zeus. But Zeus, you can see him up there with the letter Z-E-U-S next to him. Zeus, the unsleeping bolt of lightning from Zeus, came upon him. It's a story, right? What does this have to do with science? Anybody know where Cilicia is? I had to look it up. It's one of the ancient kingdoms of the place we now call Turkey. And that northern boundary is in fact a mountain range where Google Maps tells me are a string of volcanoes. So, do you see the glaring eyes? Do you see the monster under the ground? Do you see the attack of the sky? And do you see the unsleeping bolt of Zeus? I just blew up whatever recording was being made. I apologize. There was a professor I had at MIT years ago who pointed out the story of Medusa. We all know the story of Medusa. What do you know about Medusa? She got snakes for hair, and when she looks at you, you turn into stone. And he says, you go to the Mediterranean, and you look at an octopus. And surrounding the snake, in the center is the mouth. The octopus with the snaky hair, when a fish swims in range, it will freeze so that the octopus doesn't know to grab it and eat it. How much of what is described in nature is described in myth? And if you're an ancient Roman, Romans are great engineers. You should see the stuff that they built that's still standing. But they were not scientists. They didn't ask, why does lightning strike when there is a volcano? Modern science says something about the conductivity of the air and the increased conductivity when there's dust in the air and you're likely to discharge the electrical. And none of that existed in the Roman cosmology. Lightning occurs because there are lightning bolts, because there's a god up there throwing lightning bolts. Volcanoes occur because there's a monster under the ground. Not only can you explain everything in nature by assuming nature gods, you can explain everything perfectly, which is better than my science can do. Because all you have to do is say, well, that's what the nature God decided to do. And how can I gainsay that? But if you're an atheist, or almost an atheist, that you disbelieve in all the gods except one, and you disbelieve in all the nature gods, then you're stuck with the question, okay, there is no Zeus. There is no monster under the ground. What's going on there? Who were the people who were almost atheists because they only believed in one God, and that God was not a nature God, but a supernatural God? This is how the Hebrews looked at the universe. Again, a story, the story of Job. Most people think of Job as that horrible, ugly story that we don't want to read in the Bible because it makes you very sad. It's actually a glorious story. And it's a lot of passage, so let me read it slowly. God and Job are talking to each other. And God asks, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Who laid the cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? There's your extraterrestrials, by the way. Have you commanded the morning since your days began and caused the dawn to know its place? Have you entered into the springs of the sea or walked the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know this. Where is the dwelling of light? Where is the place of darkness that you can take it to its territory? You can discern the path to its home. Now, you can read this as God telling Job, shut up, you don't know this stuff. I made this. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. But I think there's another way to read it. Because when he says, you know, you were born then. The number of your days is great. I see it as an invitation. How many people ever saw that movie Blade Runner? Came out 20-odd years ago, the original one. And that wonderful Rutger Hauer's speech that I wish I could recite. You know, I've seen things you have never seen. That's what this is. The universe is full of wonders. Stop worrying about your cows that died. Pay attention to this incredibly glorious universe that he has created in a logical way. What was the story of Genesis? Where did the story of Genesis come from? People sometimes say, oh, Genesis is contrary to science. Genesis has nothing to do with science except that it makes science possible. The people of Israel who had been captured, carried off to Babylon, their kids are growing up in a Babylonian culture where they're hearing the Babylonian creation story, which is all about how the gods were fighting each other, and by mistake people were created. And by mistake the world was created. But we clever people have gotten together and we're outsmarting the gods and we're making the greatest thing the human race has ever seen, the city of Babylon. And the Jewish parents are looking at their kids saying, we don't want our kids hearing this nonsense. Here's what happened. Taking the best science of the day, Babylonian science, in the beginning, God is already there. In the beginning, God's already there before there's a universe, before there are days, before there is space and time. And in the beginning, God says, I decide I want there to be a universe. And the first thing is light, so that nothing I do is hidden. And I make this universe step by step in a very logical pattern. So logical that even today there are people who are going to say, oh my gosh, it's just like the Big Bang, let there be light. No, it was not the Big Bang. It's just logic tells you this is the order that things must have happened. And at every stage, God says, this is good. It's not by accident, it's deliberate, it's good. And what is the climax of Genesis? What is the point? It's not the city of Babylon. What is the highlight of the 7 days of creation? It's the Sabbath. And what is the Sabbath? The Sabbath is the day when you can stop and catch your breath and look at the universe and contemplate it and not worry about growing crops or building buildings. The point of creation is to have the time to do astronomy. If you don't have nature gods, you've got laws of nature. Who were the first people to come up with the idea of laws of nature? Aristotle, arguably, but Aristotle's physics was kind of sterile because nobody did anything with it. He basically just described what common sense saw. It's not until you get to the Middle Ages, St. Albert the Great, St. Roger Bacon, monks who look at the universe, monks who are given a place by the church called the university, where they can spend the time to think about these things, start the conversation up again, and have a place where it's safe for them to ask questions, where somebody will make sure that they're fed with bread and wine. And a place where they can have students to pass it on to the next generation. Science only occurs when there are scientists. Science only occurs when there are people who are willing to say, I don't know, let's find out. And not every place has that. So sure, Genesis starts with a flat world, and the dome, and the rain above and below. I ran into a fellow once who was a seventh-day creation sort of, it's all in the Bible, it must be true. Turns out he was an astronaut. But he was a good American, Bible Belt character. And I'm thinking, you really believe in Genesis? How come the space shuttle doesn't get wet? By the time of the early Greeks, we knew the world was round. You can see the shadow of the round world during a lunar eclipse. And if anybody traveled, all you'd have to do is take a familiar set of stars like Orion and come to Australia and see that it's the other way than what it was when you were in Europe. You can see the rotation, the curving of the Earth by seeing how the stars curve when we travel around the Earth. By the time of Aristotle, we knew that the world was round, and we observed that rocks fall through everything, including water. Water falls through the air. Air has flames that go up, so the highest realm of the earth was fire, and then air, and then water, and then rock, earth. And these things seem to have natural places where they went. But anything that didn't go up or down but moved to the left or moved to the right was probably alive. So that rivers had little river demons that were making them move. And trees had little tree demons that were living inside them. And the stars moved in the sky, and within the stars, if you look at a particular bright thing, which they called a planet, a wanderer, the relative position of a planet like Mars not only moved through the other stars, but moved in ways that were sometimes very complicated, very hard to understand. There were 7 of these planets: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. And these were immortalized in the 7 days of the week. So that even today in English, we've got Saturn Day and Sun Day and Moon Day. And in the other languages, if you know the other Romance languages, the days of the week are named for the planets. Martedì, Mercoledì, Venerdì. Those are the names that what we have. Tuesday is Toys Day, who is the German god, the equivalent of Mars. Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frida's Day. The way that they explained these motions was to say that the Earth was this round object, and then there were transparent spheres run by little demons carrying the planets. And if the planets moved backwards, it's because some spheres were connected to other spheres that were transparent and didn't have planets that would rotate in the other direction. So you had this whole set of nested spheres. About 150 AD, a fellow named Ptolemy said, I can work this out actually in a way that I can calculate things by assuming that there is a circle going around the sun, and then the planet is doing a circular motion along that circuit, and that's why sometimes the planets seem to go backwards and forwards. And he came up with a wonderfully complicated, but a system that worked. A system that allowed you to calculate where the planets were going to be. This was a Roman guy. I thought you just said that Romans didn't do science. This wasn't science. The reason he was doing this was so that he could come up with astrology and predict where the planets would be, so that he could predict where the stock market was going to do next week, or who's going to be the emperor in 10 years' time. It was engineering. Why did they think astrology worked? Because of those demons that were living in the spheres. Notice, though, this universe looks nothing like the universe of Genesis. Was there a crisis in the church that here's the story of Genesis and here's the universe that the modern science of AD 150 is telling us? The only hint I find of that is in the writings of St. Augustine, who says, in his book On the Literal Interpretation of Genesis, even a non-Christian knows something about the earth and the heavens and the other elements of the world, the motion and orbit of the stars, even their size and relative positions, the predictable eclipses of the sun and the moon, the cycles of the years, and this knowledge he holds as being certain from reason and experience. Science tells us. And it is a disgraceful and dangerous thing for an unbeliever to hear a Christian, presumably supporting Scripture, talking nonsense about this stuff. St. Augustine saying this. One of the interesting ironies, of course, is that the science that was known for sure by reason is now this Ptolemaic science that nobody believes anymore. Whereas the lessons of Scripture, the lessons of Genesis 1, that the universe is a deliberate creation of a God who wants it to be made and loves it and thinks that it's good, and that the goal of the universe is to do astronomy, those hold true even as our cosmologies change. That was the Aristotelian view, definitely not a Christian view, but the Christians take over that idea of the different spheres and turn that into different ranks of angels in the sky. So that with the 7 planets, there are the 7 ranks of angels, the archangels, the thrones, the dominions, the powers. Have you ever noticed, this is something that I picked up from this website. Pardon me while I do this again. Oh my goodness. You've got wonderful allergy things here. Have you ever noticed passages, especially in St. Paul, where you're told that Jesus Christ is above all power and thrones and authorities? He's not talking about military powers on earth. These were the names given to the ranks of spirits that were thought to move the planets. And the point that St. Paul is making, that Brian Purfield writes about in this passage in Thinking Faith, is that the people in Colossia who have their cosmology, and you can see in the sky things moving back and forth, especially because they didn't have city lights, you could actually see the sky. And they say, we know how this works. There are demons moving the sky who have special talents. And they speak to each other through little messengers, which we call demons, or sometimes we call geniuses. And I happen to know that my friend is really good in music, probably because there was a genius of music overhead when she was born. Therefore, by knowing when she was born, I can figure out, that's when the genius of music was overhead. What planet would that have been? And what combination of planets would that be? And if I really want to make sure I'm okay in this life, I've got to make sure that those demons are happy. And St. Paul is saying, no, we're Christians. I'm not saying there aren't any demons because I can't figure out what makes the stars move. But I'm saying this, Jesus Christ is our mediator. We don't need those demons. Jesus Christ is the one who connects us with God up in the heavens. We don't have to worry about placating all of those other pagan gods. A brilliant and startling new idea that never really quite took hold in the Middle Ages because people still wanted to believe, well, okay, sure, I don't have to placate the angels, but nonetheless, just to be sure, we've got a tradition in America. I don't know if you've got it here. You're trying to sell a house. The house won't sell. You get a statue of St. Joseph, and you dig a hole in the backyard, and you turn it upside down, and if you bury it within a week, somebody will buy the house. Now, I'm not superstitious, but People are like this. We still have our own cosmologies that, do you actually have this? Have you ever heard that before? No, thank heavens. Well, the question is, if you were doing that in Australia, turn it right side up or upside down. The universe, to our mind, is full of all of these demons that are talking back and forth to each other, if you're living in the medieval cosmology. Did they really believe that there were actual demons that you could talk to? It's a funny thing. In modern physics, we now talk about virtual photons. Things that you can't see, but that's how communication from one event is mediated to the next event. And I remember at MIT, when people are trying to explain how electricity works, well, the electron wants to go down this path because it's less resistant. The electron doesn't want. For that matter, what's an electron? If I showed you the mathematics of the electron, you would be totally befuddled. I was totally befuddled. But if you think to yourself, the electron is a little silver ball with a minus sign painted on it, and it goes bouncing down the wire. If I think that way, I can wire the house with flip the switch and the light comes on. We as human beings can't help but anthropomorphize the human race, anthropomorphize the physical universe. And even the word we use for particle physics, a particle is a little bit of dust under your bed. Trust me, the things that are measured in the cyclotrons have nothing to do with those little bit of dust. But that's the only way we can picture them in our heads, because that's the cosmology that we have. That's the operating system of common sense that we use so we can kind of guess what's going to happen next. By the Middle Ages, not only did we have this cosmology of the planets, but the cosmology of the spirits, the cosmology of the angels, and the rhythms that people worked, which could also be related to the rhythms of music. And you find this in literature. Probably some of you have heard of C.S. Lewis as the religious writer, or maybe the children's author. He had a day job. He was a professor of Renaissance and medieval literature. And he wrote a series of lectures about the Middle Ages cosmology so that his students would be able to read Chaucer or Dante and know what were the assumptions behind the words that they used. And he ends at the end of this book with this wonderful phrase of how he loved the medieval universe and the medieval cosmology. It only had one problem: it's not true. But other than that, it's glorious. But there's something else in the medieval way of looking at the world. Another underlying assumption that colors what they saw, that colors the scripture that we read and try to interpret in our own modern cosmology. And it is the nature of how the universe appeared to work. The Golden Age mentality, the role of instruments, the standard of proof. Golden Age. Scripture, chapter 2 of Genesis, is about the Garden of Eden, paradise, and we lost it. Things used to be better in the past, and we lost it. There was a time when the human race was in perfect concert with God, and we lost it. And this is not just an idea of Scripture, because the Greeks had the same idea with the myth of Atlantis. There was this civilization way in the past. The Greeks didn't know about it, but some clever Greek heard about it from the oldest civilization they knew, which was the Egyptian civilization, who had stories of this lost society where they could do everything, and we lost it. The fundamental assumption of the human race until about 1500 is that things were better in the past and things have been going downhill ever since. And if you ask your grandma, that's exactly what she's going to tell you. But if you're living in medieval Europe, you're surrounded by the ruins of ancient Rome. And you know there's no way we could build that kind of stuff. Those Romans were amazing. Things were better in the past, and we lost it. What this means, and C.S. Lewis talks about this, is that if you've got books from the past, they must have wisdom from back in the days before we lost it. And you never want to give up anything that's in those books. So, whatever is in the book, the older the book, the better, the closer it must be to the truth. Books are a source of authority. Because things are getting worse, then anything from the past is going to be better than today. The best we can hope for is to try to get to be almost as good as they were in the past. Besides, books are very rare. Writers are even rarer. Imagine that the only time you hear the gospel is when it's read to you from church. And you might hear the same gospel story once every 3 years. The stories that you remember are stories. The stories are written with hooks so that you will remember these catchphrases, because you're only going to hear them once every 3 years. That colors the way you present the theology. Think of it, tomorrow you go to Sunday church, they'll have a reading from the epistle. Nowadays, this is a bad example because the epistles are usually Acts of the Apostles, and they're stories. But if it's, one piece of one of St. Paul's letters, by the time the lector has finished reading it, you've already forgotten what he said. You remember stories. Truth is given to us in stories. Stories come from the past, back when we were smarter, because everything that's in the book, it's a relic from the Golden Age. And even if you have two books that contradict each other, it just means I don't understand it. In the medieval time, discovering things once known but since lost, it's kind of like dealing with an elderly parent. You're going to remind them of things they once knew, but we're not as good as we were in the past. That's the model. The only thing worth doing is to learn, but the only way we can learn is out of books from the far distant past. Even the Renaissance was basically an explosion based on the fact that they found a whole bunch of new books that had been lost. Well, the Arabs had held on to them. And then when the medievals captured the Arabic libraries in Spain, then suddenly these were introduced to the West. But they're still books from the past. The best we can do is maybe make a silver age of what the past looked like. That was the model of the past. Knowledge gradually fades. Everybody knows that the knowledge in the past was better. Galileo and his discovery with the telescope was remarkable because for the first time he was seeing things in nature that no book from the past had ever seen. But he was already in a milieu where new things were suddenly being discovered, where that change was already happening, where the Americas had been discovered, where the universe described by Aristotle was all of a sudden discovered to be a lot more complicated. We, in the 19th century, and a hangover to the modern times, have the opposite crazy idea that everybody in the past was stupid. Remember that picture that I started with, of the flat earth? Those stupid medieval people, what did they know? Well, just because something's old doesn't mean it's awful. Think of the music written by Bach or Beethoven compared to what's being written today. Think of the plays of Shakespeare compared to what's being, on television today. But this Whiggism, it's called, this idea that permeates a lot of our modern cosmology is that civilization is accumulating knowledge every day in every way. I'm getting better and better, and by golly, science and technology is going to lead the way to a glorious future. Who needs religion? If science and technology equaled an increase, a growth in ethics and beauty, then why was Mussolini's Italy so ugly? And why was Nazi Germany so awful? There's no correlation between technology and ethics. And yet, that's an assumption of what everybody knows today. That's one big change between the cosmology of the past, where all the knowledge was in the past, and the cosmology of today, where people want to say all knowledge and all wisdom is in the future. Galileo did something else. For the first time, Galileo discovered things using an instrument. Before him, if I described something and you had a decent pair of eyes, you could see what I saw. And you could see it for yourself, and then we could argue about what we were looking at. But Galileo had this gizmo called the telescope. Nobody had ever used a telescope to describe things that only the telescope could see. And so Galileo himself didn't realize the things that come along with using an instrument, like maybe the instrument is showing you artifacts, things that aren't actually there. Maybe with an instrument, you only see the things that the instrument is designed to show you, not everything. A few years ago, I was talking to an amateur astronomer who, as a kid, had made his own telescope. He'd taken the glass and he'd carved it into the mirror, and he'd bought a tube and he'd hooked it all up, and then mail order, he got himself a little focuser and an eyepiece, and he set this telescope up and he pointed it at Jupiter. How many people have seen Jupiter in a telescope? A few of you, yeah. And he's looking at Jupiter, 16-year-old kid, he did all of this on himself, and he sees Jupiter and he said, "Oh, I was so disappointed. I was heartbroken. Obviously, there was a crack someplace in one of my lenses, because next to Jupiter were these little dots of light." Galileo recognized them as moons, as real things. It never occurred to Galileo that maybe they were just internal reflections, dots of light. For the first time, we've got microscopes and telescopes that depend on instruments that are not particularly easy to use. People who have small telescopes and have tried to look at the moon, just even to look at the moon with a pair of binoculars, it's really hard to hold things steady. Galileo had this very long, very narrow field of view telescope. Anybody who's an amateur knows the most expensive part of the telescope might be the tripod to keep it steady. Galileo had this issue. He was traveling soon after the telescope had been invented, and he wrote this book about it. He was trying to get a job back home in Florence. From Florence, he's on his way back to Pisa to pick up his baggage. He stops in a town of Bologna. He sets up the telescope. Everybody in the village comes out to look through the telescope, and what do they see? Galileo had terrible eyesight. He focused it for his eyes. And he was having a hard time pointing it at the thing he was trying to point it at. Nobody could see anything. People started writing books about what a fake Galileo was. I looked through that telescope, I couldn't see a thing. He actually spent a lot of time in his first 5 years making lenses so that other people could make the telescope. One of the things that got Galileo ahead of everyone else was that he was up in Venice. What is Venice famous for? Glass. He had access to the best glass in Europe, but that didn't have bubbles, that was uniform, that you could actually make decent lenses out of. And even with that, he was lucky if he could have one lens in 5 that was good enough for a telescope. Lots of words, lots of words. The third point, and this was an issue that came up in Galileo's time when we were trying to understand the universe. Before Galileo, philosophers and mathematicians dealt in proofs. And proofs were outlined by the laws of logic. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Syllogism, you can work out. Euclid had his laws of geometry. which are still valid today. When Galileo is trying to argue that the Earth is going around the sun, he's looking for proof. And it's another 100 years easily before people realize that science doesn't do proofs. If you ever find somebody who says that science has proved, all they're proving is that they don't know what science is. Science can show, science can explain, science can describe, but the explanations are always temporary. The best we got today. Gonna be better tomorrow. We have any young people in this room who are studying biology? You haven't taken biology yet. Imagine you're in high school right now. You're going to be studying biology. They give you a biology textbook. And your mom says, "Oh, I took biology 35 years ago. Why don't you use my book?" You laugh. If the same son is studying Shakespeare and mom says, "I studied Shakespeare 35 years ago, why not use my Shakespeare?" You'd have no trouble doing that. Science is not the thing we study. The universe is the thing we study. Science is the tool we use. And that's why when you're learning science, you're not memorizing facts in a book. You're learning techniques of how you think about the universe. Because the facts change as we learn more. But the techniques grow much more slowly. That's also why, the Bible isn't a science book. Science books you throw away after 3 years. I don't want to throw away the Bible after 3 years. But the point is this. We now understand how we can make progress in understanding with ideas that aren't perfect if we can estimate how good are the ideas, good enough, and what is good enough. So that if I have a measurement that is 99.9% likely to be true, 3 sigma as we say in the business, then I know that one time in 1,000 that measurement probably was mistaken for some reason. And if I've got millions of measurements, 1 in 1,000 turns out to be a lot of measurements. And I don't worry if not every measurement fits, because I look at where the average is. I look where the bulk is. I ask what's the most probable explanation. And I make progress in science not by saying this is absolutely true, but this is the most consistent with what I know up to now. And in astronomy, especially when we're exploring something brand new, the running joke is you don't even look for what's most consistent, but at least with an explanation that is not inconsistent with the data. It's a completely different way of trying to understand what a probability is, of a proof versus a probability. Our understanding of how we make progress, the set of assumptions we make, is so different from the medieval time. There's one last big difference in how we understand the medieval view of the universe to today. Back in those days, the streams were alive, the trees were alive, the planets were alive. The universe was, in some weird way, alive. Let's say every morning you go out to pick up the morning paper, and you notice that there's a stray cat in the neighborhood, always kind of looking at you. You may even put out a little dish of milk for the cat. And day after day, the cat's there, and it's kind of part of your regular pattern. And one day, the cat's not there, and you go, well, okay, I hope nothing happened to it. 2 days later, the cat shows up again. You go, well, that's cats. They do that. If you are a strict materialist, modern scientist, you're going to want that cat to be there every day, and if it's not, you're going to want to know why. The phrase that you sometimes hear is madness, is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. But that's not madness if you live in a universe that's alive, because cats are like that. It's also not madness if you're in a universe that's so complicated that you really can't map out all of the forces, that sometimes you get a different result doing the experiment the same way, day in and day out. When I was a student at MIT, my office was in a building called the Green Building, which was not green. It was actually donated by a fella whose name was Green. He'd been a geologist. He'd gone off to Texas in the 1920s to look for oil, didn't find any. But because he'd been to MIT and had learned some technology, he'd worked out a bunch of gizmos that would help him look for oil, and he started selling these gizmos to his friends who were looking for oil, and he set up a company that eventually he called Texas Instruments. So Mr. Green had a good bit of money. And he put together not only the building, but, strange for America, a daily tea. 4 o'clock, everybody's invited to the middle floor, and whoever was there would come, you get free tea and cookies, and I would go up there, and there was an old gentleman sitting in the corner. You know, a couple of people would go by and say, obviously a retired professor. I had no idea who he was until later. His name was Edward Lorenz, and he was in the meteorology department, predicting the weather. And in the 1960s, he had one of the first big computers, and he would have a collection of programs, and you put in the starting conditions, and it would attempt to predict what was going to happen the next day. And he discovered that he could run exactly the same computer program 5 times in a row and get 5 different answers. And it took him a few years to figure out that he had discovered what we now call chaotic equations. That the tiniest difference in the starting conditions, like round-off error inside the computer, would give you the same results for a few days, but eventually totally unpredictably different results, which is why we can only predict the weather for about 3 or 4 days, because the equations that describe the weather are ultimately chaotic. And even if it was completely determined by the laws of nature, it would be beyond our ability to predict beyond a certain point. Our understanding of the predictability of the universe undergoes a big change. And at this point, this is the beginning of the split between the scientific view of the universe and the religious view of the universe. There are a lot of good things that came out of the 15th century, the 16th century. Galileo and his understanding of how the universe works. Eventually we'll see Isaac Newton and the laws of physics that give us, airplanes that don't fall down. One of the great things that came out of that same era was one of the great things we learned from the Arabs, along with the capture of the library in Toledo after the siege of Vienna, when Sobieski captures Vienna back from the Turks. He discovered coffee. So let's take a coffee break. Come on back at 20 past, quarter past.